Good afternoon. Welcome back to the B&H event space. You're tuned into Infrared Photography, a conceptual and technical approach hosted by Sony. For that, I'd like to welcome Thibault Roland back to the program. Thibault, how are you doing?
Thank you. I'm doing great. How are you doing, Derek?
Doing wonderful. Good to be back on here with all of you guys, and great to see you after a while. It's been we've had you spaced out over a couple months, but it's good to see you be
Exactly.
back.
Yep, it's great to be back. I'm very
Well,
excited to be presenting about IR.
IR is one of those things that the people who love it really, really love it. So I'm going to let
Hmm.
you dive in, do your thing. To all of you out there watching, if
Awesome.
you do have any questions, feel free to drop them into the Q&A. And once Thibault wraps up, we'll go over those questions for you.
Sounds great. All right. So you should be able to see my screen. If you can just confirm, that would
Looks
be
good.
awesome. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So yeah, just wanted to start by thanking you guys for hosting me again today. I also want to thank Sony for making this happen. As you can tell, I'm very excited. I'm stuttering, so how much I'm excited to talk about infrared photography. So we're going to be talking a little bit about the concept behind infrared photography, and I will dive into some more technical aspects of that technique. This is the outline where basically I'm going to introduce myself very briefly, talk about what infrared photography is, how you can actually capture images in infrared, and more specifically, we're going to be talking about infrared filters, camera conversions, and I will have a summary slide for you to be able to consider which approach might be the best for you. And we'll wrap up with some considerations and maybe a few bonus images if we have time. So that's kind of the idea today. So very briefly, my name is Thibault Roland. I'm not from around here, as you can probably tell. I'm originally from France, but I am currently based out of Portland, in Oregon. I would define myself as being a fine art photographer, specializing in seascapes, architecture, and landscape. A lot of my work is in black and white. I do use a lot the technique of long exposure, which we've talked about in the past. And today we're basically going to talk about the other favorite technique of mine, which is infrared photography. So let's jump right into what this is. Um, First of all, I do have to apologize. I have a scientific background, so I do like my graphs and how to explain scientifically things. And it's going to start here. I am going to keep it very, very simple, but what you're seeing here up at the top is basically a scale that shows you all the different electromagnetic waves that exist in the universe. And we're talking about X-rays that you're probably very familiar with because that's what you would be using to see if you have a broken bone. Could be radar waves, radio or TV waves, and so on and so forth. Here, the take-home message is that the visible light that our eyes are sensitive to is only a very, very small portion of the electromagnetic spectrum. There's way, way, way more than what our eyes are able to see. And beyond what our eyes can see, I'm sure you've heard of UV, ultraviolet. That's what makes your skin tan, basically, among others. And on the other side, you have infrared light. And this is what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about infrared, which, as you can see, actually goes quite a way beyond visible light. What we're going to be talking about today is only going to be a small portion of infrared light, but it is still going to be that part of light that our eyes are actually not able to see on their own. So just one thing that I'm going to draw your attention to is that off-the-shelf cameras, because manufacturers obviously want to be able to sell cameras that are truthful to what our eyes see, are for the most part going to be sensitive only or almost exclusively to visible light. Very, very, very small amount of the light that is going to be captured by cameras goes beyond the visible spectrum. But I'll get back to that later. So without going too scientific on you, Again, let me share with you just an example of the difference that you would expect to see of an image that was captured with visible light on the left-hand side or infrared light on the right-hand side. Um, Again, I'll get back to that later, but just as a quick indication, this particular image on the right-hand side was actually captured with a converted camera. And the first thing that you can see is how, the image, which is the raw image in both cases, but for infrared, here it's super red. And it kind of makes sense because this is, the red side of the spectrum that this camera is sensitive to. So it's going to show up as red like that. Just to make it a little bit easier to compare apples to apples, I converted those two images to black and white. So now you can see that the rendering, the effect of those two types of photography, whether it's visible on the left side or infrared on the right side, they're also extremely, extremely different. If I go a little bit more into the details of how different they are, first of all, you can see here how the vegetation basically just comes out very, very bright. I have another example that shows you some of the other differences. This is another example of trees. Just the backstory here is that those are trees that were planted in water. And I actually also captured them using the long exposure technique, which means that during the time of the exposure, those trees basically were moving around. And as they were moving around, they created these blurry lines here. But those blurry lines that you can see here, this is the foliage of the trees. So again, the foliage comes up very bright, which is exactly what you're seeing in this zoomed in image. But another thing to keep in mind is that people tend to come up brighter against a darker background, which is typically the other way around in visible photography and especially in long exposure. The last thing that I'm going to point at right now is that also opposite to typical long exposure photography, water tends to actually come up darker in infrared because it tends to absorb infrared light. So if it absorbs infrared light, you're not going to be able to capture as much of it in the areas where there's water in your images. Okay. So at the end of the day, what this shows you is that infrared photography really has the power, the superpower of changing the world as you see it and to create something that's going to be completely different. And that's absolutely what I love about about infrared photography. So now, how do you do that? How do you create images that either look like infrared photography or actually are infrared photography? Well, one way to do this is that you can do it in post. And by post, what I mean is editing. So you can just take an image like you have on the left-hand side. That's a color image and edit it in such a way that you're going to make the foliage of trees, for instance, just stand out and show very, very bright. Excuse me, I'm going to cough for just a second. All right, sorry about that. So as you do this, it is totally possible. It is very cheap because all it takes is basically your time and your skills. However, the downside of that is that it does require some skills in editing so that, for instance, in this particular example, I was able to brighten up the foliage of the trees here, but not actually brighten up, the rest of the green area on the left-hand side because I wanted to de-emphasize that. So it's possible to do this. You just need to have the skills and the time to be able to do that. And of course, the motivation to do that. So it's totally fine. However, it does require some more advanced techniques. And it may not be possible to do that in every single image that you might be capturing with a visible camera, because now if you assume that I have some red in the background as well, it's going to be extremely hard to isolate my main subject, that tree, from that red, from the green background. I said red, but I meant green background behind that tree. So what's the best way to actually capture infrared images right from the start? Well, there are ways to do this in cameras. In camera. The very first way to do this in camera is to use a filter, just like a filter that you would be using to protect your lens from UV or shocks, or a filter that you would be using for long exposure. Same type of filters that can be screwed on the lens, or that you could actually use with a square filter holder, for instance. Either one of those two will work. What you do have to keep in mind in that case is that it will force you for the most part, and this is somewhat camera and lens dependent, but in most cases, this will force you to only capture long exposures. Here on the right-hand side, you see that scale that I showed you earlier. You see the visible light, and you see how basically IR filters will cut out all of that visible light and will only let through the infrared light. If you have a camera that by design has been manufactured so that there's only a very, very, very small amount of infrared light that goes through, that gets captured, you can imagine how, um, you know, cutting out the visible light and only have this very little amount of light that goes through will force you to capture images for a very long amount of time before you have an image that's properly exposed. So this is what I mean by essentially you're going to be forced to capture images that are using a slow shutter speed, and not going to be able, with such a filter, with a non-modified camera, to capture images handheld, at least not with a very low ISO setting. But I'll get back to that later. All right, so here's an example of this particular abandoned barn that I captured with my visible camera on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, you see that uh, same barn, slightly different angle, but still captured with that same camera, um, for which I actually added an infrared filter. And you can see that it is very, very similar in terms of rendering as what I showed you earlier. So it absolutely will work. If I turn this picture to black and white, you can see how now I have the foliage that's showing as being very, very bright. So you're seeing exactly what you would be expecting from capturing an image in infrared here with those filters. Now, there's another way of capturing images in infrared. That other way is to basically have your camera, one of your cameras, sent to people who will essentially remove the filter that's located on top of the sensor inside the body of the camera. That sensor is what the manufacturer added. I'm sorry, that filter is what the manufacturer added to the sensor to make sure that most of the UV and most of the IR light is cut out so that you can only be sensitive to visible light. When you send out the camera to these people, of course, they're not going to actually bring the entire sensor assembly out of the camera like what you're seeing over here. What they're going to do is they're going to reach inside the camera, pull out the filter, and replace it with another filter that will let infrared through. Now, and I'll get back to that in a second, there are different options in terms of what filter they can use on top of the sensor that will give you different effects, different rendering, and different amount of infrared light versus visible light that will be basically captured by the camera. But at the end of the day, what it means is that now you have the opportunity to basically have a camera that will be sensitive to all of visible light as well as infrared light, or, and again, we'll get back to that later, just a chunk of that visible light or only infrared light. Now, just for illustration purposes, here you see on the left-hand side basically my off-the-shelf camera, while on the right-hand side you see the exact same camera that has been converted to infrared. The only difference that you can see is the color or you know what you could think of as the sensor, but really what you're seeing here is the filter that's laid down on top of the sensor. Here's exactly the same location that I showed you earlier, but this time captured with my infrared camera. On the left-hand side, you have the raw picture. On the right-hand side, you have the black and white conversion of that same image. You can see how, again, you have that foliage that's really popping out and a lot of contrast in the sky, which is one thing that I didn't mention earlier also, but infrared will tend to bring out contrast in the sky, especially if you just have a little bit of wisps of clouds. It will bring out this um, different contrast even more. Now, just so that you have a better comparison, apples to apples, on the left-hand side you see with a filter, while on the right-hand side you see my infrared converted camera. So slightly different, but overall very similar, right? The foliage is very much popping out. You do also see the contrast in the sky quite a bit. One other thing that I didn't mention that I'm going to talk about right now is that infrared has this power of really bringing out a lot more details in the shadows than typical, visible cameras or capturing images in visible light would be. So this is another advantage of infrared, um, capturing images in infrared. Another example of exactly the same subject, this time a tree. You can see again that foliage just popping out, but otherwise very, very similar. All right, so now, let's talk a little bit about those two different options, filters and cameras. And let's start with filters. The big drawback of filters is that if you want to do it right, it does require a lot of logistics, a lot of involvement, and a lot of time wasted. And I'm going to give you basically the checklists, the best recipe to get it right every time, but you'll see it's pretty involving and pretty complicated. So, first of all, how do you determine the correct exposure time that you need to capture an image using infrared filters? Because again, this is highly camera dependent. To a certain extent, it's lens dependent, and it's definitely dependent on the filter that you're using. Some filters are going to be darker or brighter than other filters, and you need to kind of get an idea for, you know, how long of an exposure do you need to capture to have a properly, um, a proper dynamic range basically in your infrared picture. So here, I'm just bringing this graph back just as a reminder. Again, you have the normal cameras that are very much non-sensitive or very little sensitive to infrared light. As soon as you put on a filter, you're basically cutting out all this amount of light. All you have left is this very, very little bit of infrared light. So you're gonna have to capture those images for a very long time to have them properly exposed. So the very first step that you're gonna wanna do is, of course, set up your camera on a tripod because again, we're going to be using very long exposures, so you don't want that camera to be shaking or moving or anything like that. The next thing you're going to be wanting to do is to basically focus and take a picture without the infrared filter. So it's going to be just visible light. This is 100% to start, and we're going to actually step away from that in the next. um, step here. What you're going to want to do is increase your ISO. Again, it's only going to be temporary, but as high as it gets so that you don't have to wait 2 minutes or however long it's going to be before you actually have the feedback to figure out whether you're properly exposed, whether you're properly focused, and so on and so forth. So very first thing you do, you crank up your ISO as high as it gets. Some camera you can go to about 100,000 ISO. It's going to look horrible. Absolutely agreed on that. But to help you set up, this is going to really, really be much more convenient for you. The next thing you're going to want to do is set your exposure time to somewhere around a second. It can be half a second, can be a second, can be 2 seconds. It's just the order of magnitude here, just so that you will be able to see something in the image that you're going to be taking. So you're going to take that picture and you'll look at the histogram and the image you just captured. That image might be underexposed, might be overexposed. Let's say it's overexposed like what you're seeing here. What you're going to do is you're going to crank down your exposure time to say half a second. So crank it down by a stop, going from 1 second to half a second. That's one full stop. And you're going to take another picture. You're going to look and see if it's still overexposed or not. Um, in my opinion, this particular image, this particular histogram that you see at the bottom here, which represents how bright on the right-hand side or how dark your image is on the left-hand side of that histogram, in my opinion, this is still overexposed. So I'm going to crank it down another stop. Um, and I'm going to go from half a second to a quarter of a second and take another picture. Now, this is looking much better to me. I think this is a reasonable image to use, or because you can see how you're still oversaturating in the infrared quite a bit on the red channel, you could crank it down, say, another stop. So let's try that. Now you have an exposure time that's an eighth of a second. You have a histogram that is still overexposed on the red, but this is kind of expected. Um, Infrared is this one type of photography where I would say if you're overexposed in the reds, it's totally normal and you can recover almost all of it if or at the very least a lot of it, and you're still going to be okay because again this is infrared we're talking about. We're expecting your image to be super saturated in the reds, so if you still are overexposed in the red in your histogram, that's totally fine. So now I would consider either the previous image or this one as being fine in terms of exposure. Because I have to make a choice, I decided to actually pick this particular one. The next thing you're going to want to do is basically go back from your super crazy high ISO, which is 100,000 something, all the way down to an ISO number that's basically really good for your camera. And this is also going to be somewhat dependent on the camera that you're using, because some cameras are going to be better as, say, ISO 100 because it's their native ISO, than other cameras that may be better at ISO 64. I believe Nikon cameras, some of them, it's their native ISO. So whatever your native ISO is, just go back to it and calculate how many stops it corresponds to. One stop of light will be dividing that ISO number by 2. So if I go from 100,000 to 50,000, that's one stop. 50,000 to 25,000, that's another stop. And you're going to do this all the way to say 100. At that point, between 100,000 and 100 ISO, this is 10 stops difference, which means that if I'm doing absolutely nothing but put the IR filter on top of my lens, I will need to increase my exposure time from where I'm at right now, which is an eighth of a second, to the exposure time that corresponds to an increase in 10 stops. And that number, if I'm multiplying that exposure time by 10 times in a row, so if I'm multiplying eighth of a second by 2, that's a quarter of a second, times 2, that's half a second, times 2, that's 1 second, and so on and so forth. If I do this 10 times, I end up having the need to be using 2 minutes as an exposure time. So now, if I were to take a picture with that filter on at ISO 100 of 2 minutes, I'm going to end up having the exact same or super close histogram and exposure as my really short, absolutely horrible because too high ISO picture. So this is a very good way to figure out for yourself what the combination of your filter, lens, and camera basically correspond to and how dark these are. The next time that you're going to take a picture, just take a picture at this super high ISO. Again, you're going to be checking your focus, which is the next slide I'm going to talk about. But all you'll have to do is basically put on the filter, take a picture at, say, an eighth of a second, and now you're going to know that you need to do 10 stops. So it's going to make things easier for you in the long run, even though right now, like I said, this is pretty complicated and pretty involving. Now, there's another thing that you need to keep in mind when it comes to infrared, and this is true whether you're using filters or converted cameras, but for converted cameras, what you see is what you get, so you don't have to actually jump through the hoop that I'm going to present right there. What happens with infrared light, and again, remember, I'm a scientist, I like my graphs. What I'm showing you is basically a lens, and light that goes through the lens, light is coming from the left side, and it gets focused on the right-hand side. You see two colors here. The first color is blue, just to show you that this is where blue, or you can think of it as being visible light, where it's going to focus. So if your sensor is located where the blue is focused, well, there's this thing with lenses that with infrared light actually gets focused further away from the sensor, which at the end of the day really is just a fancy way of saying that if you're focusing for visible without the filter with your camera and put your filter on the lens, very likely, and again, this is somewhat lens dependent, but extremely likely that your image is going to be out of focus. So if I'm illustrating this, and how do you fix this? You're again going to take a picture without that filter on. And you're going to focus with visible light. This is again just going to be your starting point. After which you put on the filter. Once you have the filter on, increase your ISO setting all the way up. Again, remember 100,000 ISO or something like this. And take a picture at that good exposure time that we were talking about earlier. It might be an eighth of a second, just like the previous example. At which point you're going to be checking the focus of the picture that you just captured. To do that, just call back the picture and zoom in as much as you can. And you're going to take a look at a high contrast area. If you can see that high contrast area is perfectly sharp, then great, you're done. You can just take the picture, you don't have to worry about it. Most likely, it's not going to be perfectly focused. And it's going to be hard to tell because you're using such a high ISO. But I can tell you, this example here, it's not perfectly focused. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to very slightly offset, kind of blindly, offset my focus ring one way. And I'm going to take another picture and take a look at that picture and see if my focus is better or if it's worse. If it if the picture is looking worse, like what you see on the right-hand side, well, guess what? I went the wrong way. So I'm going to go back and further out than where I was initially and take another picture. Once I take another picture, maybe I'm going to be better focused. Maybe I'm still going to be a little bit out of focus. Maybe I'm going to go too far the other way. But at the end of the day, what I'm going to do is I'm going to repeat this, right? Like kind of blindly move my focus ring one way, take a picture, see if it's better. If it's better, then I know this is the right way. I should keep going. If this is the wrong way, I'm going to go back and basically repeat this back and forth until I have a picture that's going to be super well focused. Once it's super well focused, I already know what my exposure time should be. I'm just going to go ahead and take the picture. And now I know 100% that I have a properly exposed picture, that I have a properly focused picture as well. I'm done. I can go home and I'm going to be happy, right? So at the end of the day, this is a lot of work. This is very complicated. This is a lot of things to keep in mind. Filters are great because they're very cheap ways to get into infrared photography, but they come at this cost, right? That you're going to have to fumble quite a bit in the field if you really want to get it right. Now, if you want to make your life much, much, much simpler, that being said, it is going to be more expensive too, but it's going to be super easy, is to basically use option number two, which is to have a camera converted to infrared. There's a number of different companies that will do that for you. I'll show you in a minute what companies I've actually personally used or heard very good things about. But if I go back to this particular graph, you can see again, just as a reminder, the off-the-shelf cameras, mostly sensitive only to visible light. This is for filters. Now, what we're talking about is going to be cameras that can be modified so that they can potentially be sensitive to all these different type of light. Now, a little bit more in details, uh, there are options that each have their name and each have their scientific label. So the name would be what you see written here in letters. The scientific nomenclature is basically the numbers right there. Those numbers, they basically say what type of light that the particular conversion of camera will be sensitive to. So what it means here for, say, hypercolors, 470 nanometers, 470 nanometers corresponds to the color blue. What it means is that it's going to be sensitive to all the visible light that is to the right-hand side of the blue color here, as well as infrared light. There is another type of camera that is very popular, which is called full spectrum. Full spectrum basically means that it's going to be sensitive to everything that the sensor could be able to capture, would be able to capture. Going from the ultraviolet light all the way to infrared, including visible. And then each other option basically corresponds to a slice of light, visible light, together with infrared light, where the visible light that is going to be captured is going to be more and more, sorry, less and less. So in proportion, the infrared light will be having a stronger effect because you're cutting out more and more of the visible light. Now, you might think, which one is the best? Why do you even have all these different options? Well, you have all these different options because each option has a different effect. A full spectrum camera, again, will be sensitive to visible light as well as IR. you can actually also use this particular camera and put on another filter on top of it. And depending on what filter you're using, you could potentially select each one of those different options. Each one of those different options will still have a little bit of color, except for the standard IR, which itself is typically the type of filters that you would be able to get for cameras that have not been converted to infrared. I know it's very, very complicated. It's also highly dependent on your personal taste. So if you want to know what my recommendation is in terms of what options I selected, I actually selected the super color 590 nanometer conversion because it still does have a little bit of color in the visible spectrum, as well as it gives you an extremely strong effect with the infrared, which means that the foliage of the trees is going to be very, very bright, for instance. There's going to be a lot of contrast in the sky. And because I still have this little bit of color, it actually helps me isolate my subjects better. And what do I mean by isolate the subjects better? Well, what I mean by that is that if I look at my raw pictures, now what I can do is basically massage it in a way that's called channel swapping, where I would be changing all the reds into blues, all the blues into reds, or I might do something a little bit in between. And this is something that you would have to test for yourself and play with. But the bottom line is that I can make it so that the vegetation basically will stand out in terms of color from the background. For those of you who were familiar with shooting infrared film, it's somewhat similar. At least the concept is similar, and you can play with those colors in different ways. The way, I mean, the reason that I want to be able to do this is that now if I'm looking at my almost raw image that you can see here, do this massaging, I can now very easily change basically my sky color from the rest of the picture. And now it's very, very easy for me to make selections and isolate and edit, the foreground or the sky or anything in between very differently, right? So this is one of the advantages of this particular conversion. But now, at the end of the day, what it means also is that it does require a little bit more skills in editing. So it's kind of a give or take. It's much easier in camera, but it does require a little bit more finicking, in editing. If you wanted to keep it as simple as possible in editing, my recommendation would be to actually get the standard IR conversion, which corresponds to 720, where you don't have any color left anymore. And then now you essentially going to have a almost straight on black and white conversion. So these are the different companies that I have either used myself in the case of precision camera because I'm a Sony shooter. They're the people who actually, um, you know, do the maintenance of Sony cameras when they're broken and things like that. So they know their cameras very, very well, which is why I went with them. But Live Pixels and Colari are also two very reputable companies that will do the black and white conversion for you. I have not tested them myself, but I've had people who come to workshops of mine who've used them and have had really good experience with them. So now, if I am summarizing, basically summing up the different options that um, you have everything here in this table. I'm not going to go through all of this. I'm just going to give you the highlights. Fake infrared, meaning that you're going to be using editing to obtain the same effect as if you were capturing an image straight on in infrared. basically is going to be pretty simple and pretty quote unquote cheap because it doesn't require any additional equipment. And it's simple because you're still using your camera. However, it does come with, the drawback that you do need to get much more involved in editing, even more than the infrared cameras that I was talking about just a second ago. Um, Filters are a very good and fairly inexpensive way to get into infrared photography. However, they do come at the expense that, as you saw, it's very involving in terms of process to make sure that you have a good a, a picture that's properly exposed for one, and two, that is actually focused. Um, if you just want to test it out, absolutely be my guest. If you think that this is a technique you want to invest much more in, my recommendation would actually be to have one of your cameras, maybe an old camera that's just collecting dust on the shelf, to have it sent out to be converted. The conversion itself is going to be a little bit expensive. Typically, it's between, depending on the camera, $200 and $400. And you will have to pick what option of conversion you'll want based on, the recommendation, the different images that you can find on um, the website of those different companies. You will see exactly different effects. Again, my recommendation, if you want to be able to isolate your subject, would be 590 nanometers. If you want to keep it as simple as you can in terms of editing, it would be 720 nanometers. One thing that I did not stress out probably enough is that with infrared cameras, because now you're going to be able to capture so much more infrared light, you are going to be able to use these cameras handheld. You are not stuck to be um, using those cameras with a slow shutter speed. You can totally use them with a very fast shutter speed, and that's also the advantage over filters. Um, so this is basically already what I told you, so I'm not going to spend much more time going over those last few sentences here. Also, this is recorded, so you can feel free to go back and, re-listen to any of the things that I mentioned before. Now, there are a few things that you need to keep in mind, generally speaking, when creating images or capturing images in infrared, whether you're using a filter or an infrared converted camera, both. The first thing is that there is something that people tend to call hotspots. This particular picture is a little bit special because it's just of, clouds passing by, but you can see how in the center of the picture, it is much, much brighter. Here's another example of this happening. In this particular picture, you have kind of like this elongated, brighter spot in the center here. This is typically caused by internal reflection of light inside your lens. It is 100% dependent on the lens that you're using and how it's been designed. There's nothing you can do about it except then use a different lens. Some lenses are going to be better than others when it comes to shooting in infrared and not having those hotspots. It's super hard to edit out because, as you saw earlier in the previous picture, excuse me, in the previous picture, it was almost um, as a circle, so that could be okay to edit out. But in this particular picture, it's elongated. Um, Sometimes it also changes shape depending on the location of the sun and things like that. So, long story short, it's really, really, really tough to fix, even with the AI tools these days. Um, so you do need to get very familiar with the lenses that you use, and you do need to pick out those lenses very carefully. There are ways to make it a little bit better on those lenses that create it. It's not going to prevent it 100%. It's just going to limit it somewhat. And to limit this is that you want to avoid using super wide apertures. So let's say f2.8, f4, something like that, or super small apertures. Let's say f16, f22, because this will actually create even more problems, even more hotspots. You want to be kind of in the middle there. Typically, and that depends on the lens you're using also, but usually you run f8, f11 is better. Not necessarily great, but better. The other thing that's very annoying with infrared that you have to absolutely keep in mind, especially if you're using filters, is that infrared is going to be extremely sensitive to any sorts of diffraction or very little hole, very little gap that may be anywhere in your system. If you're using tilt shift lenses, if you're using a square filter holder, and there's a gap between the filter and the holder. If you're using, say, a DSLR and you're not putting up tape over the viewfinder and there's light that goes through in there, it's going to create these really, really weird shaped diffraction patterns. There's almost no way to fix this. Sometimes, if it's a picture like this, I guess you could crop somewhat, but very often images, you're composing them in a way that's pleasant. If now you're cropping that way, you're changing the composition, it likely will not work anymore. So one thing to keep in mind is that to avoid these type of things from happening, you can use all kinds of things. You can tape up the viewfinder, you can use a weather jacket, you can tape up, around the filter so that there's no gap between that filter and the filter holder, all kinds of things like this. But just be aware that this kind of things can happen, and this is typically because there's a little bit of a hole or crack somewhere in your system and you need to fix this. Now, I believe this might be the last thing that I'm going to bring to your attention when it comes to infrared photography is that it is extremely sensitive to um, the outside temperature and it's creating a lot of noise, just generally speaking. So if I'm zooming in here, there's a lot of noise in that particular image. This is pretty typical of infrared. Of course, now you have lots of tools, including AI, to reduce that noise, but keep in mind that if you're using small sensors, if you're using super high ISO, if you're using extremely long exposures, or if you're shooting in very high temperature environments, all of these factors individually, and even more if they're compounded, will create more noise, which may be to the point that, too much is just too much. So if that's the case, definitely use the long exposure noise reduction, use the high ISO noise reduction. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time, especially that we're um, getting close to the end of the presentation, but I just wanted to point out or to recommend some of the pieces of gear that I personally use and I would yeah, recommend if you're interested in infrared. So I'm a Sony shooter. I have an A7R4 that has been converted, like I mentioned before, to 590 nanometers. And very often I will use these lenses, especially for infrared, because they're very good for it. Now, I am going to go over a few images and just talk a little bit about them and why I wanted to shoot them in infrared. Well, this particular picture of a waterfall in Iceland, I wanted to capture it in infrared because that particular day was a clear blue sky day. There was a little bit of mist and a little bit, of contrast basically right above the waterfall, but the rest of the sky was very, very dull. So I decided that infrared was basically the right tool to actually bring out a little bit of contrast there. I also knew that it would bring out a lot more contrast in the vegetation, basically at the bottom, that moss at the bottom of the waterfall, because I thought that this would make some really nice contrasts. This was pretty, much in the middle of the day with super harsh light. And I knew that if I were to use a visible camera, I would lose so much of the details of the rocks here. But with a with an infrared camera, I was able to bring out a lot more of those details in this particular picture. So for all these different reasons, I knew that using an infrared converted camera was basically the way to go. This particular picture I also wanted to use with, uh, I wanted to capture it in infrared for a couple different reasons. Because one, I wanted to increase the contrast of those really cool streaks in the clouds. And two, I also wanted to bring out details of the vegetation, turn the foliage very bright, much brighter than what it would have been with a visible um, camera. This is a picture that I shot a few years back in France where essentially, so I don't know if you guys are familiar with this location. It's called the Mont Saint-Michel, St. Michael's Mount, in the north of France. This particular day was super crazy hazy, very little details whatsoever in the sky. So what I did in this particular case, I also used my infrared camera because I knew it would bring out so much more contrast in this particular image. I just wanted the silhouette, of that monument, of that island in the background. And that brought out just enough contrast in this picture to make that happen. I also captured a few other pictures so that I would basically have this flock of birds in different locations and that I brought in to layer in this particular picture. So this is a composite basically of a couple different images or three, four different images of the birds in different locations. This two images. Again, I just wanted to bring out the vegetation on the left-hand side, increase the contrast in the sky. And on the right-hand side, one thing I didn't really mention, but I kind of consider it part of vegetation. Well, infrared will also bring out um, the contrast and details of seaweeds. So seaweeds will also turn out brighter, just like foliage would. Not quite to the same extent, but it will also. And so by basically using my infrared camera, I was able to get all these details here in these rocks just because I wanted to bring out basically all these seaweeds and vegetation in these different rocks. Um, those two images I shot over here in Oregon, and I also wanted to shoot them in black and white. I'm sorry, in infrared, because I wanted to bring out some details in the vegetation. I didn't want to have those details overpower the main subjects here, which are the waterfalls, but these were also shot close to midday, very harsh light, and I knew that if I shot those images in visible light, I would lose all those details in the vegetation. Everything would appear super dark, um, and it would just be very, very hard to get an idea of what the context of those pictures are. So this is pretty much where I'm gonna stop, at least before the questions. I just want to point out that I do have a few workshops that are coming up here in the Pacific Northwest in October, for the most part, where I'm going to be teaching long exposure as well as infrared photography. So if you guys are interested, just check those out. Feel free also to get in touch with me. This is my contact information, email here, if you have any questions. I do also have a couple newsletters on my website that you can sign up for so that you know when those lectures, such as this one, come up in the future, as well as some of the tips that I share in those newsletters, so that you can improve your skills and become better photographers. That being said, Derek, if we have any questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Yes, we'll kick it off with a question from Chuck. How do you set your camera for white balance? What do you white balance on? Is it a white card, clouds, green grass, or something else? And does your white balance change depending on the filter you're using?
So the white balance will definitely change depending on the filter that you're using. Yes. That being said, I'm going to answer with a non-answer by saying that I do not really bother with setting up my white balance in camera because I'm so used now to seeing those images on the back of the camera with that, in a way, red filter that I already know how I can actually convert them to black and white. So I'm kind of like already thinking about those images in my mind. And I would encourage people to just like experiment with their images a lot, take a lot of pictures and like play with them in editing and figure out how they can fix them or convert them to black and white. That being said, my other non-answer is white balance is so easy to fix in post. It's like 2 clicks that even when I'm shooting my images with my color camera, I don't bother fixing the white balance in camera either, because again, it's just so easy to fix.
Yeah, I was going to ask, is it the same as shooting a regular color camera where you're not locked in? There's nothing that changes in the makeup of the image.
In my opinion, I approach it exactly the same thing. And I still use this quote unquote color contrast, even though it's false color, and even though there might be only, let's say, the very end of the orange and a little bit of the red that remains in terms of true colors in the right sense of the term that we consider, and I'm going all scientist on you again. But as on what our eyes are actually sensitive to, there might be so very little remaining, but I consider it exactly the same way that you would consider, say, if you take a picture, I'm going to give that pretty famous example of this one red umbrella in a sea of black umbrellas, right? Um, to me, vegetation will still have a little bit of color in it. And so this creates that color, quote unquote, false color contrast in my images that I'm going to be using to isolate my subject with.
Okay. Makes sense. Sounds like it makes sense to me. I don't shoot IR, so, but it sounds like it. Rich is asking, with your converted camera, it looks like you're still choosing to shoot long exposures. Are you using ND filters to make that possible?
Yes, the short answer is yes. I don't have to stick to shooting long exposure, but I'm a long exposure junkie. I can't get enough of it. It's just such a cool technique. It transforms everything that you see, that paired with infrared, which also transforms everything that you see, is just to me a way to create fine art photography. Sometimes I will shoot with short exposures, like the picture of the St. Michael Mount, Mont Saint-Michel, that I showed you earlier. This
Mhm.
is a short exposure, but I just love to be able to create something different with the long exposure.
Perfect. Well, it looks like that covers the questions. Thibault, always great having you on.
Cool.
It's a huge thank you to you and, of course, Sony and all of our viewers out there watching. Of course, if you guys are watching this now, you should know about our YouTube channel where you can catch this. That will be staying on our YouTube, as well as all of our other pre-recorded live events. So that is all we have for you for today. Another edition of the B&H Virtual Event Space, now in the books. Catch y'all next time.
Thanks, everyone.